Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I would like to talk about this camera right here. It's the Fuji X-T2. Yes, this camera is not new, it's been out for a while now, and no, this is not a review video, it's just a video where I just want to explain my opinions and my thoughts about this camera because I actually love this camera so much. It's actually my favorite Fuji camera that I have and own and ever use, really. Right now I'm having the X-T3 filming me, but this camera is still, in my opinion, like operationally better than my X-T3, and to a certain extent I also like the images coming out of this camera more than the X-T3. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Fuji X-T2, this camera has been out for a while. Yes, I'm aware of that, but it doesn't mean that the image quality or the video quality kind of deteriorates over time. It's just there are newer technologies out there that can produce sharper results and sharper videos, but to be honest, this camera still produces really nice like photo results and also video results, and the operational side of this camera is also still really good, and I really enjoy using this camera. But I'm also not easy on my gear, so the first day when I got this camera, which was like years ago, I even cracked the display. You might not be able to see it because I put another glass screen protector, the glass screen protector, on top of the display, and that too is slowly cracking up, so I'm definitely not easy on my gear. Even like the first week of getting this X-T3, I dropped that in the train as well, so I'm not easy on my gear. And this just kind of proved to survive my harshness of using my gear when I'm outdoors. But anyway, in this video I'm gonna be splitting the video in terms of like ergonomics and operational side of things, and then I'll talk about the photography and video side of things, and then into the conclusion on what I think about this camera. Obviously from my tone you'll probably know already that I kind of have good thoughts about this camera, but of course it has its own advantages and disadvantages, and my background is I'm a Canon shooter. I am still mainly a Canon shooter. Most of my DSLRs are Canon and then some Nikons, and my mirrorless in the background is a Canon mirrorless. I mainly shoot with Canon on commercial shoots, like paid shoots, mostly portraits as well, and also video work. And Fuji is just because my girlfriend is a Fuji shooter, and I think it's just easier to have a Fuji camera in the bag as well when we're traveling, like on my side, so at least we can share accessories, share lenses and everything. So that's why I got into Fuji years ago. But yeah, let's get into the video. So first I would like to talk about the ergonomics and the operational side of this camera. Again, I'm not like Fuji first shooter, I'm a Canon and Nikon first shooter, so my opinions might vary, and also different photographers may have different needs for their functionalities of the cameras and how it operates. I'm not a loyal fan of like, oh, I'm so biased for this brand because I'm using it. I'm not that type of shooter, so I'm honest when I say what I like and what I don't like, but don't take that personally that, you know, you're using Fuji and you're a huge fan of Fuji and everything. So don't take it too personally. It's just based on what I need. Anyway, so the dials and the ergonomics of this camera. I really love this camera, the ergonomics of it, though it's on a little bit of the smaller side of the grip. Not small, that is bad, but like, I've seen smaller grip DSLRs that feels better. So yeah, usually I would have it with this Arcus Swiss grip, but since my last shoot was like a portrait shoot and I was using the battery grip, that's why I have the battery on here. And yeah, I was shooting a little bit of video as well, and the battery grip just gives me the extra boost. And do you really need a battery grip? I think to a certain extent you might, depending on the type of shooting you do. If you need the fast frame rates, then I think so. And if you need the extra video power, then yeah, sure, why not? And usually I would have this camera paired with the 16mm f1.4, which is filming me right now, so that's why I have this lens on, the 10-24. But the overall compactness of this camera still makes it really nice and easy and light to carry around, because it is a really small, nice and light camera, and it feels really rugged in the hand. It doesn't feel cheap like the X-T1. I'm sorry about the X-T1 users, but like, I have the X-T1 in the background, and that camera feels very, very, very cheap to use, especially when I'm coming from the DSLR side of things. You know, my cameras are like the 5D series kind of thing. I'm not bragging, but it's just like if you're coming from such a rugged built camera and then you use the X-T1, and then it just feels really cheap, and it only took a really short while until the rubber starts peeling off. And that's not even being in such a harsh environment. But anyway, into the X-T2. Again, back to the X-T2. I also love the buttons and dials on this thing, and being a small camera, obviously you have very, very few buttons compared to the DSLRs. Most people just criticize DSLRs for not having enough buttons compared, like customized buttons compared to modern day mirrorless cameras, but on the other hand, semi-professional to professional DSLRs, they have a lot of buttons that are essential, whereas smaller mirrorless cameras like this one, it has very, very few buttons, so giving the choice of customization, of course, it makes more sense to have more customization so that you can customize to the buttons that you mainly, like the functionalities that you mainly will be using. And that's pretty much what I did with this camera. So even the AFL, AEL here is not really functioning as the name suggests. I have one for wireless enable and the other one for self-timer, and everything, all the buttons have been reprogrammed to what I would shoot on my Canon and Nikon DSLRs, and also on my Canon mirrorless system. The screen is not a touch screen, though seeing how bad the touch screen on the X-T3 is, I kinda like don't miss the touchscreen on here, unless if it's like as good as the Nikon and Canon's touchscreen on their mirrorless cameras. I really don't mind it not having a touchscreen on here. But like for photography, I really prefer the screen that tilts up and down like this versus on the Canon what you see with the fully articulating screen, because as a shooter, it's more discreet and quicker to just flip it up and down like this rather than flipping it outside and then putting it up and then putting it down, things like that. So it's just saving that extra few seconds that I much prefer. And another point is something that a lot of people, well, at the time when I was researching about the X-T2 before buying this camera, what a lot of people didn't really mention is the buttons, especially the dials and all the operational buttons up here. It's really satisfying on the X-T2. If you compare it to the X-T1, this camera, like all the buttons just has a really, really satisfying click and confirmation, and it's just really nicely soft, but also not too soft that you wouldn't know that it's a confirmation click or not. And I really like that. And now that I also have the X-T3 for a while now, actually, I still prefer the buttons on here and the shutter sound on here. The buttons just doesn't feel as clicky as the X-T3. The X-T3, I hate all the buttons with all my heart because it's just super clicky. Whatever you press, even if you press really lightly, there's click sound. And it's not like mega loud, but like you hear it. Whereas on here, you don't really hear the sound, but it's just like you know that you click on something. And it's just really satisfying. And even the shutter sound on here is so much better sound than the X-T3. But then again, this is just what I like, and it's really subjective. And if someone prefers the, like extremely clicky sound, very clicky buttons of the X-T3, then of course the X-T3 is going to be in favor of many of those people. Then we have the card slots, and to many people, having dual SD card slots is really, really huge. To me, I'm never really a huge fan of 2 card slots. It's nice to have, that's what I feel about, at least what I do. Of course, there's always the risk of losing data with every single SD cards that you use, but you know, like if I avoid using SanDisk, I know it happens to many other manufacturers as well, but to me SanDisk, especially the Extreme Pros, corrupt way too much. I used to use Lexar, and obviously now they're kind of out of business and a different company is producing Lexar cards, but it's not the same original one. But to me, I used to find that Lexar is really good, and I still have quite a bit of those laying around, and it works better than SanDisk, and that's just kind of like my way of combating against the data losing. But obviously any SD card will fail at some point. But anyway, usually what I set is, it really depends on the assignment. If I'm shooting portraits, I would set one for JPEG and one card for RAW, simply because if I want to just like give sample before editing, just give like a quick sample or transfer the sample images to the person who I'm photographing or my clients, things like that, then it's just very easy. And with Fuji, the wireless transfer app especially, unlike Canon, they don't convert RAW to JPEG right away when you're viewing or transferring wirelessly through the phone. So for example, with Canon, if you're using their Connect app, and if you shoot all of your images in RAW, the app would still recognize all of those images, all of the RAW images, and you still can select all of the images that you want and then download. On the Fuji Connect app, at least with mine, like if there's a way to also read RAW and download RAW that converts directly to JPEG, then please let me know. But from my Fuji Connect app, the wireless app, it would only recognize the JPEG files, so I always have to shoot RAW plus JPEG anyway, so that the phone can just download the JPEG images. Whereas the Canon, it just loads really quickly, the RAW images, and then when I click download, it just converts it automatically in the app into JPEG, so that I can just add it in the mobile Lightroom and everything, and then just transfer it to the clients or the person I'm shooting or whatever. Yeah. So that's kind of the downside of this, that there's always that redundancy that I have to do, one RAW, one JPEG. But yeah, that's just minor nitpicking. Obviously, some people will find the use for something else, like an overwrite or just redundant backup, so that if one card fails, then they still have images or videos on the other card, so that they don't lose everything should one card corrupt. But yeah, that's about the dual card slot. And the battery, it's the older NPW126S battery. I would say that on the X-T2 it's actually quite nice, but once you put it on something like the X-T3, then this battery really isn't enough. The X-T3 really drains a lot of power, but on the X-T2 it is still manageable. And again, being like only available in secondhand means that the accessories for it are also really cheap to get nowadays, so there's that. I really highly recommend getting the generic one from Fuji, because the third-party ones are not weather sealed, and I know there are other features that the third-party ones will give you, like the intervalometer mode, but then again, this camera also has intervalometer settings built in, and yeah, and it's just not much difference, just to like price-wise, at least where I live, not much difference getting this and getting the third party. So having the option of weather sealing for me is a huge win. And talking about weather sealing, I really like how rugged this camera is built in terms of weather sealing. I've really thrown it around in rainstorms and snowstorms, and also traveled in Southeast Asia through the heat wave and everything. And well, heat wave, Southeast Asia, tropical countries aren't as hot as like the Sahara Desert or something, but it's still pretty hot at some point as well. So yeah, it survived quite a bit, and I don't know, it just never really let me down. But being Fuji, sometimes, like once in a long while, it crashes, but it does not crash, like froze, nowhere near as much as the X-T3. The X-T3 sometimes just crashes without any reason, and also sometimes just stops recording the video even though the battery's full, there's no overheating, and the card speed is like, the capacity is still there, and the card speed is like the highest that the card slot accepts. So I don't know why, but I have it on the latest firmware. All of my Fuji gears are on the latest firmware now, but yeah, at least this camera doesn't crash as much. So in a sense, this camera is still, to me, more reliable than the X-T3 that I'm using to film this video. But obviously for video, the X-T3 will have a sharper image, as well as having better autofocusing system for video and photo. Like when it comes to tracking, it's so much better. But that's for another video. Yeah, so weather sealing, build quality it's not the best, but it's really there, and I really like using it. And because of the form factor, it's also very discreet to take pictures and videos, because it's just, I don't know, you can hide it in so many places that nobody would really notice when you're using this camera. Even if someone would see you using this camera, they wouldn't really take you seriously, which is what I really love about this camera. Because if I use my Canon DSLRs or Canon mirrorless cameras, because being full frame, the lenses are also big, like much bigger than this one, people notice, and some people can feel a little bit offended. Whereas if I use this camera and just go snap, 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 no one will feel offended, to be honest. And it really helps me a lot when when I do travel photography and also just street photography and just trying to document people. So yeah, and not having them notice me as much or not paying attention to me just helps me to blend in with the environment as well, rather than like them being aware of like, oh, there's a guy with a big camera, so be careful. And yeah. Then the next part is the viewfinder that I would like to talk about. The viewfinder on this camera is really nice, bright and big, and it really helps you a lot when you're shooting outdoors when there is sunlight, because like the color representation of this viewfinder is almost accurate and almost the same as what it's presented on the display here, which is really, really, really helpful, because many cameras, like for example Sony mirrorless cameras, at least in my experience, the viewfinder here, the saturation on those cameras is really different from the LCD, and it's sometimes hard to judge the color that you're getting on the final result. And with the Fuji X-T2 here, the color representation in the LCD viewfinder here, I just find it really, really, really close to almost no difference to the actual LCD here, which helps me tremendously if I'm like framing outside on like a bright sunny day and then I can't really see the display here. Just put it up to my eye and then like I can trust the LCD viewfinder to actually represent that color information and not just the framing part. Because sometimes when you have too saturated LCD viewfinder inside, you will start playing with the picture style, the white balance, things like that, and that just kind of like throw you off a little bit. Obviously, if you're shooting in RAW, you can always fix that, but to me, despite always shooting in RAW, I prefer to have it as correct as possible or as perfect as possible in camera and then just do the rest in post, because I don't like spending too much time in post editing images and everything. And talking about the images, I'll talk more about that in a bit, but like the RAW files and also the JPEG files are also really robust coming out of the Fuji system, so that's pretty good. And the next thing I would like to talk about the autofocusing system. I know I briefly touched upon it, but I think I still need to mention it. The autofocusing system on this camera, yes, if you're shooting like single shot autofocusing system, it's very, very accurate and it's also very quick. But if you change it to like the continuous autofocus, it starts hunting around everywhere. And like, okay, if you're a Fuji fanboy and always been using Fuji from the X-T1 and everything, then yeah, this camera is really good if you're used to that. But if you're coming from like the DSLR perspective or DSLR background, the continuous autofocus on this camera just hunts way too much. When it gets it in focus, but it also gets easily distracted. And that's the huge downside about using this camera as the continuous autofocusing camera. Unlike, it doesn't need to be intensive use, it can just even be street photography and you're just tracking a certain biker. It can just be distracted by certain other elements. And especially if you have it like set on face detection mode, Fuji cameras for some reason, like, it's hard to turn, it's more time consuming. It's not harder, but it's just more time consuming to turn off or ignore the face detection if you have it enabled. So with Canon and Nikon, if the face detection is enabled, and if I can't say this for Sony because I forgot how it works, but for Canon and Nikon mirrorless cameras, if you have face detection enabled, and if it detects the face and it focuses on that face, but if you want it to focus on something else, you just tap on the screen. And then it will just automatically focus on the area that you want to focus on. But on the X-T2 and X-T3, if you have face detection enabled and it for some reason detects like a branch of a tree is a face and ignoring the actual face in front of the camera, which happens way too many times, then even though I click on the actual face that I want to focus on, if it's more confident that the tree branches are the face of the human, it will just ignore where you tap or where you set the focus points to and just focus on that face. It will not loosen it until you tilt the camera and then pre-focus and then come back and then just press the shutter or completely disable the face detection. And that's really, really annoying. I just wish that even though it detects the face or what it think the face is, at least give us the option of like tap on an area or move the autofocusing point to that area that you truly want to focus on, and then let us take the picture, at least for that particular frame. Because I've been fighting a lot with Fuji cameras when trying to take pictures and have face detection turn on and it recognizing certain part as faces and just completely being too stubborn to move over to the area that I would like to focus on. So that's one thing about the autofocusing points that I really don't like about Fuji cameras in general. But I'm sure a lot of people are used to it, and I'm sure there are people who can use it to their advantage. It's just, to me, it's just a lot of time consuming and just frustration that I don't like to handle with Fuji cameras in general. Though I cannot say this for sure for the X-T4 and the X Pro 3 because I haven't had my hands on them. But for the X-T3 and all the way down, I have a lot of those cameras and I can tell you that it's really frustrating. Yeah, and back to the dial up here. I know I've been jumping back and forth, I'm sorry. But it's just a lot of things just come to my hand. Like, even though I really like the styling and the look of the dials up here, if you're coming from a DSLR background, obviously this is subjective. If you're used to work in like a really pressure environment and everything, you'll find that these dials are actually really slowing you down because yes, they're very tactile, it tells you exactly what you want, it's very easy, but in the same time, if you're used to something like, I don't know, shooting with a 5D or the D800 or D850 or whatever, then you'll know that those cameras are much faster to operate by just flicking the dials like back and forth here, because it is still much faster action just having your eyes to the viewfinder or the eyes to the screen and then just switch with clicks of buttons, and here you still have to adjust it with the dials. So that's a little bit of downside for me, but aesthetically it's also nice. But to many people I know, it's also nice to have the dials up here, that it feels tactile and it feels like they're communicating with their camera and having certain connections. So there's that. And one last thing about this camera that I kind of have problem with all of the Fuji cameras, to be honest, and like, well, I can't say for sure with the X Pro 3 and the X-T4 for those cameras, but all the other Fuji cameras that I own and also have tried in the past is this problem of turning on the camera and then turn it back off and then suddenly turn it on, and it just doesn't go back on until you press the shutter button long enough and then it just goes back on. This is just the problem that many people will not see it as a problem, but I see it as a problem because a lot of times when I think I'm done with the shoot, I just turn off the camera and maybe something all of a sudden like spontaneously just happened and I really wanted to capture that. I would miss that shot because, like, obviously sometimes people will just say like, yeah, just leave your camera always on. But this being a mirrorless camera, it always sucks in a lot of battery and everything. It's not like a DSLR where you can just leave it on all day and it's not draining a lot of power. This is a mirrorless camera. If you have it on, then the sensor is always on and everything, unless you have it set to like auto sleep mode or something. And whether it's the X-T3, X-T2, and many other cameras from Fuji, the on time is always way too long, and it's just making me miss a lot of decisive moments already, and that's just a huge downside I find for the operational side of this camera. I mean, aside from all the good things that I love about this camera, this is like one of the most hated thing about Fuji cameras as a whole for me. Like, yeah, you can defend the camera what you want, that the camera is still going to be power on after suddenly turning it off and suddenly turn it back on if you just long press the shutter button. But my point is, I'm still going to miss that shot if it happens spontaneously. Whereas with my Canon DSLRs, Nikon DSLRs, but also Canon and Nikon mirrorless cameras, is that when I power them off and then suddenly power them back on, it stays on. It just doesn't go off, and then I just focus and then just take the shot, and most of the time I will not miss that shot with those cameras. But with Fuji cameras, I just wish they do something with the camera that it just starts up much quicker, and if I suddenly power off and suddenly power back on, it should power back on instantly and not sleep. So to me, that's a failure side. That's a huge failure point. But obviously this is just for like my way of shooting. Sometimes if I'm shooting this for travel photography, street photography, things like that, or portraits even, like sometimes you think you're done and then you really call it a wrap, and then suddenly there's like this perfect moment and then you just miss. So yeah, there's that. But enough with the operational side of things for now. I would like to talk about the image quality and video quality. The image quality is really nice. Like, yeah, sure, it's an old 24 megapixel sensor, but it's a really nice image coming out of this. Like, the roll-offs into the highlights, when the highlights is too harsh, it's not natural. You can kind of argue with that, but in the same time, the detail that, like the information that it gathers and capture in the raw file, whether it's highlight or shadows, it's really a lot of information, especially thinking about how old this camera is. Well, it's not that old, but technologically speaking, in terms of years, it's still pretty old and compared to what's out there by now. But in the same time, it still delivers really nice results. The information, the details, when you recover from the highlights and shadows, it's really nice. The skin tone rendering is still pretty nice in JPEG. In RAW, if you're editing with Lightroom, the skin tone is a little bit weird, but I'm still a Lightroom user. I have downloaded Capture One, but to me it just makes no sense to completely switch to Capture One just because of a camera. Obviously, Capture One also released the free software as well, the free editing software. I forgot what it's called now, but anyway, if you're using Fuji, there's the option for that. But, you know, having most of my catalogs, presets, and settings, customized settings as well on Lightroom for all of my other cameras, it just makes no sense to just start using a new editing software or switch all over to a new software just for one brand of cameras. And yeah, so to me it's also like kind of a failure that they kind of partnered with Capture One, but and pulled off all the image profiles away from Lightroom, because most people are still using Lightroom, and also no photographers should adapt their camera. The tools should adapt to the workflow, not the other way around. So for that, it's just a huge middle finger from Fuji, for me. That's just my perspective. But if you're just talking about the files alone, it's pretty great. And what I love about this sensor more than the X-T1 sensor, obviously the X-T1 sensor will produce unique images as well and unique color rendering, but with this sensor there are less moire and aliasing coming from this sensor than the X-T1 and other cameras like that came earlier than that. So it's really nice to see that huge improvement, and it's so much more usable now, even in studio environment, because of that much less moire and aliasing that you see from the sensor. So yeah, and the details hold so much better, not only the details from the resolution, but just the details overall. Like the resolution gives you details to a certain extent, but the ability of the sensor to capture the whole detail of that is a different story. So the X-T1, yes, overall it's a sharp image and everything, but if you zoom in, the details are lacking, and it's not really the details of the resolution, it's just the details that the sensor kind of failed to capture a little bit. But it's nice to know, and also to see that this camera not only produces nice color, but also capture really nice detail in those detailed areas of the image or the subject that you're capturing. I hope you understand what I mean by that. But yeah, anyway, that's just my thoughts on the photography side of things, well, the photography image side of things. But for video is somewhat different because it's still the earlier generation of the video from Fuji, if I can say it that way, because I mean the X-T1 did have video mode, but it was not aimed at video shooters at all. Whereas the X-T2, when it came out, it was really trying to hit the video shooters with the battery grip having that headphone input and having a mic input here, as well as like the 4K recording and also 120p full HD recording. And like just a lot of video features overall, but obviously if like it still shows that it's from an earlier days. Obviously this camera has really good dynamic range in video, but if you're just comparing natural sharpness without the digital sharpening, you'll find that even something like the in perfect daylight, in like perfect environment, and you'll find that sometimes even something like the iPhone 8 will produce nicer and sharper image quality. Obviously, the image quality doesn't tell the whole picture because this still has the benefit of changing lenses, so you still can get different perspective, and also focus will have, like, the focusing system will have a much bigger impact in the storytelling from a camera like this than the iPhone. But just given like a perfect lighting condition and also the same focal length of both cameras on both the iPhone and the X-T2, you'll find that the iPhone will produce actually nicer results and also sharper results without digital sharpening. So yeah, but all in all, this camera still is a really fine camera, and for a video autofocusing system, it's really nice if you are not really focusing something rapid and if you're not really focusing on a face. Even faces, okay, in full HD is okay, but you lose face detection when you go to 4K. So there's that. Over time, the focusing system actually did improve from the firmware updates, but it's nowhere near as good as the X-T3. But even then, it's still nowhere near as good as the Nikon and Canon autofocusing system in video, and obviously not as good as Sony in that regard as well. But it has come a long way. It has indeed come a long way. Can you get a certain job done with it? Yeah, you can, but I wouldn't really put this on top of my gimbal and just trust it to focus, because I have done that before, and even a simple landscape theme, it will sometimes hunt and it's just weird. So yeah, there's that. And in video, it is a little bit weaker than in photography in the way that sometimes it's still easier to see moire and aliasing pattern. Like the sensor has to work extra hard to get that readout, and it's just not really reading out it too clean that you're completely out of moire and aliasing. It's just, it's there more often than in photography, but still nicely controlled. And if you're shooting in super slow motion, the 120p mode or the even 100 frames per second mode, it's still gonna be very soft. But if you're shooting at something for like social media, things like that, social network like your Instagram, I think it's totally fine. I have shot a full documentary about Thai state quarantine with this camera. Well, 90% of it was done with this camera. The other the other 10% was done with the 5D Mark III, iPhone 8, Fuji X-T2, Fuji X-T1, and yeah, all those cameras. So this camera really stood up to the task very well, and I was also really amazed by the video quality and the skin tones in the video, which was nice. And the film simulations on this camera is really practical. Like, I don't usually use a lot of film simulations in photography because I just shoot raw and I just edit to myself, but in video it takes extra time to edit all the 4K footage that the film simulation actually can be a really good tool to really apply to the video and just do minor edits on here or no edits at all, because it really does look good. It's not just like a gimmick filter effect on the video itself, but it actually works. Like, you can actually use it as a proper look for a film look, even if you're just filming vlogs or documentaries or short films. So that is something I really like about this video quality coming out of this camera. Now onto the conclusion. I know there are a lot of points that I should be mentioning, but it's just that I have so many things to say, and if I just don't like shorten certain things out or skip certain things, this video will just drag on and on and on. So just into the conclusion, I still recommend this camera for many people. If you're just starting out in photography, or if you're trying to get into the Fuji system, or if you just need the camera that, like, if you don't care a lot about vlogging and getting face detection, then this camera is also a nice overall package, because the photography side of things is really good. The frame rate is there, 5 frames per second, and you have the boosted mode as well with the grip. Obviously in real world that can really varies because this autofocusing system does take time, and depending on the subject and the lighting condition, you know, the 5 frames per second can drop down to even 3 frames per second because it needs time to acquire the subject in a more tricky environment, lighting environment and everything. So yeah, there's that to really keep in mind. But otherwise, it's a nice overall package. There's super slow motion in video, the 4K is nice, albeit with a bit of crop, and yeah, the camera design is good. It's really light and portable, but it's also really nicely weather sealed. Yeah, it's just overall a nicely solid camera to have, really, and I still recommend it simply because the last point is the price point. The price point of the X-T2 now, you can get it under 500 euros. If you're finding it more than 500 euros, then it's a bit too expensive, I find. It's just, it's not worth it if you're spending more than 500 euros. That being said, the Fuji lenses are known for being very expensive. Very expensive. Fuji fanboys can defend it all they want, but like a 35 f2 is, like the weather sealed one is very expensive. And also the non-weather sealed one for an f2 at like around 200 euros. To me, that is still much more expensive than the f1.8 50mm on a full frame that's also not weather sealed, and that sometimes, well, depending on the version, can produce much better images than the 35 f2 from Fuji. So yeah, and those are still like between 90 euros to 150 euros. Obviously this is depending on where you live, but yeah, Fuji lenses tend to be more expensive. That being said, Fuji kit lenses tend to be a little bit sharper than other kit lenses from other manufacturers, but the flaring is so much more annoying. So what you gain on the sharpness, you lose on the flaring control, that the flare is just does not look natural on Fuji kit lenses. So that's something to keep in mind. But otherwise, if you have enough budget to get a decent lens from Fuji side of things, then yeah, I really highly recommend the X-T2. It's a nice workhorse. The battery life lasts decent, I think after all the firmwares, it's just getting the camera to the point where it's like, it's workable if you have like 2 or 3 extra batteries backup. So yeah, and the spare batteries, even from reliable third-party sources or third-party companies, they're really affordable. You can get like 2 nice third-party batteries with a charger for like under 30 euros nowadays. So it's really nice, and it's been out for a while, this battery model, so you really have a lot of those flying around on the different marketplace. So yeah, overall I highly recommend it, and if you need a free photography guidebook, it's linked down in the description below, and as my photography 2021 calendar as well, it's also linked down in the description below. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. Otherwise, I wish you a great time, have fun shooting, stay safe, bye.